Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December 3rd edition of our wildfire seminar series. Today, we are hosting Kimiko Barrett, who is a lead wildfire research and policy analyst at the Headwaters Economics institution. That's an NGO. And Kimiko has been basically trying to figure out the true cost of wildfires. And that's a very important thing. I guess if you don't know the true cost of any hazard, you cannot really kind of hedge your bets against it and make the proper changes. So we are very interested in hearing what she has done in this area. And with that, let me yield the floor to her.
Yes, okay, great. Thank you. I'm assuming everybody can hear me, as well as let me share my screen here and we will start with that. Okay, and is everybody now seeing a screen as well? All right, fantastic. Yes, okay, well, thank you so much for this invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group, and I've been following the series and the previous panelists and speakers, and it's a fantastic cohort to be part of. And I'm thrilled to see that Michael Gollner will be next week's speaker as well. And I think we all build off of each other quite well in trying to expand depth and understanding on the enormous, wicked challenge of wildfires. So I was asked to come and talk about, what is it that we're looking at with respect to wildfires? What are some of the big questions out there? What do we envision as being a fire adapted community to these increasing risks? And then perhaps very importantly, what are some tools and some efforts being done on the ground to help better understand, explore, and reduce wildfire risks? So I do apologize up front if what I cover or what I go over is redundant for this group. Obviously, you're a very, very knowledgeable, savvy audience. And so, again, apologize if this seems like it's pretty surface preliminary context, but I think it's important to set the stage and to really dig into the latter half of the presentation, which looks at some of the communication and modeling tools we've developed to help understand this enormous challenge better. So again, my name is Kimi Barrett. I am the lead wildfire researcher and policy analyst with Headwaters Economics. And I'll talk a little bit more later about who and what Headwaters Economics is. But what I really want to do is just start with a very general question. And if we were doing this in person, I'd be able to field it out to the audience and get hands up in the air. But I just wanted you to take a minute to think about this question of wildfire risk. And if you have a number in your head of how many people in the state of California, out of a population of roughly 40 million people, do you believe are located in what would be considered medium to very high areas of wildfire risk? So by that, I'm talking about anywhere from that 40th percentile of wildfire risk all the way up to 100% more or less guaranteed to experience a wildfire in the next 5 to 10 years. So just think about that for a moment. And that's kind of our icebreaker question. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a map of where those high areas of wildfire risk are indicated. And as we move forward through this question, keep that in mind. If you came up with, close to 30 million people or so, then you wouldn't be too far off. So roughly 26 million people in the state of California are located in medium to very high areas of wildfire risk, which seems like quite a bit. How does it compare to the other Western states? It's high, it's a lot. And a lot of that, of course, is because California does have the highest population of Western states. But in addition to that, you're looking at places like Arizona, Washington, they're hitting about 2 million folks or so. A place like Montana, where I live here in southwest corner of the state, has about 1 million people, or 700,000 rather. Oregon's around 1 million people, and then Idaho's up around 800,000. So in terms of absolute figures, California certainly does outpace the rest of the country. And this is similarly reflected in terms of proportion of total population. Montana, again, where I live, is up there in terms of how many the proportion of the population that's located in these medium to high areas of wildfire risk, which is about 2/3 or so. Idaho is about half of the population. Arizona, Washington, and Oregon are about a quarter of the population. So this is just some context to think about what are we dealing with respect to wildfire risk and where people are living. And it's really to shed light on this broader context that when you're talking about the 11 Western states, wildfire risk is ubiquitous. There's very, very few places that you can go to that are not exposed to some degree of wildfire. And this is similarly indicated really across the country. Obviously, there's pockets that experience very little, if no wildfire, but in general, much of our country does have and has lived with a history of wildfire. And roughly 170 million people or so now do live in these areas that are experiencing increasing wildfire risk. So this is just the stage with which we are going to engage in this concept of wildfire and how to become better prepared and adapted to it. As I said, my name is Kimi Barrett, and I work with a group called Headwaters Economics. It's a nonpartisan, independent research group based out of Bozeman, Montana. I kind of compare us more or less to a policy think tank. I myself live next door in Livingston, Montana, but we work with communities across the country on really wicked, complex issues. Everything from flood mitigation and hazard reduction to energy use and production to recreational and public lands issues, housing affordability questions, and then of course, wildfire research and mitigation, which is where I lead our efforts in. What I want to do in this presentation is talk about three main things. One is what are the increasing risks and trends with respect to wildfire? What is it that we're looking at with respect to creating a so-called fire adapted community? What does that look like even? And then perhaps very importantly, what are some of the tools and resources out there for decision makers on the ground to better understand, explore, and reduce some of these risks? So let's get started with the risks and the trends. And again, I do apologize if some of this information is redundant or you have heard it in the previous panelists. I'm going to just recap it very quickly. And then of course, I'll open it up to questions at the end of the presentation if we want to cover any of this again. So risks and trends. Well, we do in fact, and certainly you in California know this more than anyone, know that wildfire risks are increasing with respect to duration, severity, and frequency. At the same time, more and more people are living in areas considered wildfire-prone lands, or the wildland-urban interface, as it's most commonly called. What does this look like more specifically? Well, in terms of duration, it's about 84 days in terms of absolute figures, or roughly 3 months in terms of the extension of the wildfire season. So spring is coming a little bit earlier, fall is lasting a little bit longer, and in many places, there is no longer a quote unquote wildfire season, and that we're experiencing these increasingly on a year-round basis. This is similarly experienced across the globe, in which there's been roughly a 20% extension in the average wildfire season. So places like the Amazon, the Mediterranean, the Russia, Taiga, and other places are similarly experiencing these increasing wildfire duration trends. Wildfire severity has gone up substantially, about 700% in terms of the numbers of acres burned by what would be considered a highly severe wildfire since 1985. This is really important because it has direct implications for ecosystem functioning and forest health. So things like soil rejuvenation, organic material, forestry growth, all of that is impacted by how hot and intense a fire burns, or the severity of it. And in many situations, you're starting to reference these wildfires or hear about them being called nuclear events, because indeed, they more or less act like a nuclear bomb, and they neutralize the ground and its ability to regrow some of those very, very important organic materials. So 700% increase in severity. All of this is, of course, exacerbated and amplified by increasingly dry landscapes and ecosystem conditions. So in the Western US forests, they've been about 75% drier than they have historically been. And this is directly linked to an earlier snowmelt and increasingly unpredictable precipitation patterns. So all of this creates obviously more fuel, more ripe conditions for highly hot burning fires that last longer and burn faster. And then more people are living in areas that we know are going to burn. Again, this is commonly referenced as the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, which now contains 1 out of every 3 homes out 1 out of every 3 homes as of 2010. So this does not account for the most recent census data, the past 10 years, and particularly what we've experienced with the COVID, more or less urban exodus movement. So 34%, it is the fastest growing land use type in the country, outpacing all other forms of land use development. This has been directly linked to an increasing number of structures lost. So since 2005, on a conservative count, we've lost about 100,000 buildings to wildfires. And sadly, a lot of these have come from California. So about 60,000 structures have burned, again, conservatively since 2005. And that doesn't account for 2021 wildfires. This has led to wildfires costing much, much more. So suppression, or the money spent to contain and extinguish a wildfire, has substantially gone up. And now the average wildfire costs about $65 million, which is doubling the cost of what it was in 1999. So with all of these increasing trends, we unfortunately do know that the problem is likely to get worse. Having said all that, I am going to try and be optimistic throughout this presentation to encourage you all to know that we do, in fact, know how to do things better and differently. We do indeed know how to build safer, smarter homes and communities that are better adapted to living with this increasing risk. And we have the science, the data, and the materials to do better and smarter homes in wildfire-prone areas. So that's really what I'll be talking about in the next portion of this presentation. So what do we mean when we talk about smarter, more adapted homes and communities in these wildfire-prone areas? Well, let's shift to the next phase of this presentation. What is a fire-adapted community? And to do this, I think we need to step back for a minute and let's just think about a hypothetical community where fire adaptation has been explicitly integrated into how that community anticipates and plans for a wildfire. And so let's think about this hypothetical situation. It looks very much like where I live here in Southwest Montana, or very much like a community in California. And a wildfire breaks out in the backcountry. At this point, it's not a significant concern because it is in the wildlands. However, you know, forest management agencies are starting to perk up, and it starts to move downwind with predominant winds. In your case, that would be the Santa Anas and the downward slope of the terrain, and very quickly does start to threaten some of those structures most adjacent to the wildland vegetation. And at this point, we consider it a wildland urban fire. And what I want to do is bring your attention to the area that I've just highlighted here, where those homes are right next to that forested or unbuilt vegetation landscape. Because in all reality, right here, this unit of analysis of which that structure is adjacent to the forest looks much more like this during a wildfire. It's an ember storm. Thousands and thousands of fireballs being hurled through the air anywhere from 1 to 4 miles ahead of a wildfire front. And if they land on any combustible or flammable surface, they have the potential to grow in size to threaten nearby structures. And so when we're talking about what it takes to mitigate some of those vulnerabilities to a wildfire, what you're actually talking about is reducing the amount of combustible materials to embers, because those embers account for 90% of all structures lost during a wildfire. And this is really important when you're thinking about what creates a fire-adapted community, because unlike the common narratives and media portrayals of this wave of fire flame coming down a mountainside, or the tsunami of fire, it's actually these embers, these thousands and thousands of matchsticks being thrown through the sky. And as I said, if they land on any flammable surface area, they have the potential to become a spot fire or grow in size and intensity to burn down that home and therefore neighboring structures. So imagine for a moment what is actually flammable or combustible on a home, and it actually puts it into a much simplified context. You're dealing with a structure primarily built of wood that surrounds a bunch of petroleum-based products. And then very, very importantly, you have to think about what's on top or what's surrounding that wooden structure. So you're thinking, you know, in some situations, it's a wooden roof. Certainly that's the case here in Montana. But then it's also things like pine needles or vegetation and debris along those roof valleys or in those gutters. It's things like what's on your deck, which is very likely also made of wood. It's like firewood or furniture. Sometimes it's a propane tank. And then you surround that with things like bark mulch, juniper, shrubs, trees, and then you place it in a very dry, overstocked forest. And that home is very, very susceptible and exposed to ignition from a wildfire. And again, those little embers that can fly so far ahead of a wildfire front. So these are the little mitigation and vulnerabilities that you're trying to reduce when it comes to mitigating wildfire risk to the built environment. And that's really important to remember, that that's the problem that you're truly trying to address in many of these situations. And you see this evidenced over and over in post-fire analysis, in which the structure is still burning amidst a green canopy or green trees. So in other words, the flammable surfaces are those that have combustible material around them, and then the unflammable or uncombustible materials are still surviving. So what is a fire-adapted community? It's a community where opportunities to integrate wildfire mitigation to reduce the intensity, speed, and propagation of a wildfire have been explicitly integrated into the planning framework of those communities and neighborhoods to a wildfire event. It's things like targeted fuel breaks around the community itself, landscaping regulations that state what types of plants and materials can go around a structure, watershed management and land preservation tools such as open space or conservation easements to act as a buffer. It's subdivision design standards that ensure that there's adequate ingress and egress for evacuation protocols or water supply units, road width, things like that can be incorporated into the actual design and development of neighborhoods. Public resource and development codes, and in California, very, very importantly, you have building codes like Chapter 7A that stipulate what kind of building materials and design features and assemblies can be included in homes located in wildfire hazard areas. And then all of this, of course, is heavily subsidized and supported by local, state, and federal government decision-making. So that is what we hypothetically and ideally call a community that's better adapted to living alongside increasing and inevitable wildfire. And you see that this works. Anecdotally, it worked through evidence that was collected from the Camp Fire in 2018. And now more recently, it's been statistically proven as well in peer-reviewed journals. So this is a home that was built to wildfire resistant standards, meeting the highest measures of Chapter 7A and beyond, and located in Paradise Butte County, California. And we all know that, of course, Paradise experienced the devastating Camp Fire in 2018, and this home survived while 18,000 of its neighbors burned. So we do know that wildfire resistant design and construction materials can improve wildfire resiliency and home survivability during a wildfire. So you incorporate that at broader neighborhood scales, and that would be part of that wildfire adapted community framework. Okay, so let's shift gears again. Let's talk about what some of the tools are now that we know what a fire adapted community looks like, what you're trying to reduce those risks and vulnerabilities from. What are some options and resources on the ground for local decision makers to better understand, explore, and reduce these risks? Well, what I want to do is highlight two specific tools that have been done in partnership with Headwaters Economics and some of our state and federal institutions, universities, and research organizations at the broader national level. So the first one is wildfire risk to communities. This was done in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service Washington, D.C. office, the Rocky Mountain Research Station located here in Missoula, Montana, commonly known as the Missoula Fire Science Lab, and then a fire modeling company also based in Missoula called Pyrologics. So Wildfire Risk to Communities is a website to better understand, explore, and reduce wildfire risks. It was stipulated by Congress in 2018 through the Omnibus Bill. And what it does is provide interactive nationwide maps, charts, and data at consistent levels and methodologies that can be searchable at the community, county, and state scale. It looks like this when you enter the website, which is wildfirerisk.org. And you can see immediately upon entering the website that you have three different pathways with which to understand, explore, and reduce wildfire risk. And I'm not going to go into the understand and the reduce pages of this because of time limitations during this presentation, but I do encourage you to go and explore them, especially if you're interested in understanding some of the literature review, the background material, the vernacular and the vocabulary used to actually understand how we have described risk within this website. What are some of the materials that back it up? And then who are some of the scholars out there who are really digging deep onto some of these concepts? So again, I'm not going to go into that right now. The reduce page also is really important because it can lead you to 9 different mitigation pathways that we've identified that help communities reduce those vulnerabilities and provide that mitigation strategy at that personal and neighborhood scale. But like I said, we're not going to spend time on that now. What I really want to do is get into the explore pathway, which is more or less the meat behind this website. It's the main portal. Once you enter that, you'll land on a search index that automatically populates according to the geography that you're interested in. So for example, if we were to explore Los Angeles County, California, then you would start typing it in, and as it automatically populates, it will show you which community, county, or state level of geography you may be interested in. So I've gone ahead and I've selected Los Angeles County. By default, the website opens up to a tab called Wildfire Risk to Homes. Wildfire Risk to Homes integrates wildfire intensity alongside wildfire likelihood. And it poses the hypothetical question that if a wildfire were to occur, what is the relative risk if a house existed here? So therefore, it addresses that question not only to existing structures, but proposed new developments as well. So this again is what that main default web page looks like. It gives you a brief description on the left-hand side of what it is that you're looking at. You'll also see that your geography with which you selected is located in the left-hand corner. And then as part of this, it has a breadcrumb trail to geographies that rest above it or different scales. All of those are hot linked. So if you are interested in knowing kind of what is the nested scale that you're in, you can go ahead and hover your mouse over that, click on it, and it automatically would open up into that other geography. For example, if I wanted to know what California's scale of risk would be, I could just click on that. The page would automatically populate. But we're going to keep it for the purposes of this demonstration just at Los Angeles County level. There is also, in addition to that, as I said, kind of a summary statement. So you're looking at Los Angeles County has roughly 58% greater wildfire risk than compared to other counties in the state of California. This is really important when you think about the relative comparison of who you're comparing yourself to with respect to risk. And I'll get into that in 1 minute here. But I also wanted to highlight here that there is a scatter plot at the bottom that does visually demonstrate, again, where your county or geography rests relative to other counties or geographies you're comparing yourself to. And then as I just mentioned, the relative risk is important because there is an option now that was just introduced. It's a new feature in which you can toggle between your universes of comparison. So for example, we know Los Angeles County has greater risk than 58% of counties in California. But if you were to expand that out to compare yourself to all of the counties in the country, you're going to notice a change in that risk metric. So for example, look what happens here. If we were to toggle from California to the nation, Los Angeles County's risk quickly changes and goes up quite a bit. And now suddenly you're in the 90th percentile of relative risk. So again, your universe of comparison has expanded quite a bit. So it's really important to think about what are your parameters of comparison when you think about what wildfire risk is. So that's an option that you can help toggle between what it is you're looking at and what are your geographies of comparison. We're going to go back to Los Angeles County for this. So I also did want to indicate that the scatter plot is a hot link. So if you were to hover over any of those other dots on that scatter plot or geographies, a window automatically populates and tells you what it is you're looking at. So for California, for example, Mariposa County is in the 100th percentile of wildfire risk. So all of those are hot linked tabs. So in the right-hand corner, you'll see the other wildfire data tabs open to you. So outside risk to homes, the other one is exposure type, wildfire likelihood, and vulnerable populations. So looking at the exposure type next, this one is really, really interesting because what this is demonstrating is the level of exposure to both direct sources of ignition, such as flame contact, and very, very importantly, indirect exposure. And this is wind-blown embers. As I said, embers actually account for 90% of all structure loss during a wildfire. So understanding and visualizing which areas of a geography, a community, or county are threatened by those indirect ignitions is really, really important when you're talking about planning and mitigation efforts. So in Los Angeles County, for example, you can see that roughly 7% of the county is directly exposed to flammable vegetation, whereas 17% of it is indirectly exposed through wind-blown embers. And then a large proportion of the county isn't exposed at all because it is comprised of non-combustible surface area. And in that, I'm talking about things like concrete. So you think parking lots, airports, these big, enormous surface areas that can't burn because they're non-combustible. So the more metropolitan, the more urban area you are, the more you're going to have this not exposed risk layer show up. If you were to look at places more rural, like a place like Mariposa County, for example, or other counties in California, you would see that much of it is actually going to be indirectly or directly exposed. So the more metropolitan, more urban you are, the higher non-exposed surface area you're going to have. So that's the exposure type, really interesting. Wildfire likelihood indicates the probability a wildfire will occur in any one location. It's very much linked to risk to homes, but yet it's another visualization of that. And then one thing I do want to feature here that I think is really neat and cool as part of this website is, wildfire likelihood probability is in the upper right-hand corner. It takes you to a couple other pages on this website. So in addition to the take action, which would lead you to 9 different mitigation measures to reduce wildfire risk, is a download tab. And I would think for this group, it might be particularly relevant, but it will take you to a U.S. Forest Service archive database, at which point you can download all the tabular summaries in the form of Excel spreadsheet for any of these geographies, and very importantly, the GIS files. So you can actually go around and play and look at these figures and these tabular summaries yourself to come up with your own findings and conclusions and data analysis. So that's the download tab. And then the glossary would take you to specific context descriptions and interpretations for some of the words and concepts used throughout the website. So that is wildfire risk to communities that I wanted to quickly feature. As part of this, off the Headwaters Economics website, we have taken all this information, packaged it up into a report in which you can run it by community, county, or state. A pop-up window comes up and you can download it as either Excel or as a PDF. And it looks like this when you get it. So it takes all of that wildfire risk data, puts it into a package, again, either as a PDF or as an Excel spreadsheet, and you can just download it onto your browser. The spreadsheet is very, very valuable and useful because you can copy and paste a lot of those bars and charts directly into a document or report or a grant for some of our community decision makers that we work with. So I wanted to quickly feature that too as part of that tool. The next tool I want to talk about is something we more recently released that builds off of and is very closely wedded to wildfire risk to communities, but it integrates that risk layer alongside underlying socioeconomic demographic variables. And that comes from the American Community Survey, or the ACS survey, that's run by the US Census on a 5-year rotation. So the unequal impacts of wildfire was done because we do indeed know that wildfires do not affect all people equally, and that long-standing cultural and institutional barriers limit and influence the ability for people to respond to, recover from, and rebuild following a wildfire event. So let's look at what this tool does. Well, it looks like this. It's off of the Headwaters Economics website. And we've tried to make it as easy and as intuitive as possible. And so we've lined it out with some 3 basic steps. At the top, you can indicate and filter what level of risk you are interested in. Again, this directly builds off of wildfire risk to communities. So you can indicate if you're wanting kind of the very, very low end of wildfire risk, all the way up to the 90th to 100th percentile of wildfire risk. It's searchable at the county level for both the country as well as individual states. The next step would be to filter between those socioeconomic demographic variables that you are interested in. And so there's 7 different ones that you can toggle in between. And we have done this as a median comparison to the national average. So if you want one of those specific variables above the US national average, you would just indicate that with the drop-down toggle option on these menus. And I'll go through this here real quick. The map at the bottom automatically populates according to the filters that you've selected. And then there's summary takeaways at the very bottom to make it just easier for you to capture what those key takeaways might be. So looking at this, if we were to do it for California, for example, and say I was very, very interested in knowing the proportion of families that do not have access to a car, because that might play into account of evacuation protocols, information we would need to get out there for planning efforts, and also recovery, of course, plays into account with respect to households without cars. So if you were to toggle that and say I'm interested in knowing high proportion as well as alongside and overlaid with wildfire risk, that map at the bottom automatically filters based off of what you've selected above. Also, similar to wildfire risk to communities and the scatter plot, all of these counties are hot linked. So if you were to hover over them with your mouse, a window automatically populates and shows you a breakdown in absolute figures, what those socioeconomic variables would be, as well as a link to that downloadable report that automatically populates as a PDF. And then at the very bottom, again, are those summary takeaways that can be really important when you think about who can recover from, who can respond to, and who can adapt to these increasing wildfires. And this is off of the Natural Hazards tab within the Headwaters Economics website. So that was a lot to cover. And it may seem like this to many of you, that these risks are too great and too monumental to overcome. But I want to leave on a really positive note. And this comes directly from a great wildfire historian that we work with very closely, Stephen Pine out of Arizona. And he has looked at the chronology and evolution of people living alongside wildfires over the course of history. And he always makes the point, and I love this story so much, of when you look at Western migration and settlement of the United States back from the late 1800s up to current time, you know, there was a point when, as we started to move westward, we were building entire cities and urban areas that kept repeatedly burning down, such as what you're seeing here, the Chicago fire of 1871, the same day and year that the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin occurred, in which 1,700 people perished in one wildfire event, and more than 200,000 people were left homeless. So these cities repeatedly burned down because of wildfires. And at one point, following the 1906 wildfire in San Francisco, really, we as a society collectively decided that we were going to do things fundamentally different and start building our urban areas with wildfire in mind. So we had things like evacuation protocols set in place, we had fire alarms, we had doors that easily opened, we installed fire hydrants, we stopped using combustible materials in our siding, in our roofs, we stopped using boardwalks made of wood, and we replaced these increasingly with non-combustible, more fire-resistant building products and technology. So we've actually solved this problem before from an urban planning perspective. We can solve it again if we start using those same principles to the wildland urban interface. So I just like to leave on a positive note, as Stephen Pine always remarks, there is hope and we have solved this before. So I think with that, I will leave my contact information up there momentarily, and I think I've allowed roughly 15-20 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Kimi. Any questions from the audience? I have a whole bunch of my own, but I'll wait if others have any questions.
Maybe I can get started if you don't mind me to.
Yeah, go ahead, Hamid.
So thank you so much for the very nice presentation. Of course, I have a lot of questions, but the one question that I would like to, if you have time to elaborate a little bit on it, and I think, of course, was not probably that you didn't have enough time to address that. So I know that you have been doing a lot of research on the economic impacts of wildfire and measuring this economic impact. is it possible that you add a few words on that and what you have been doing and what is the really state of art on that area?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we have done analyses on the various costs of wildfires. Very top level, we've done a study, in addition to looking at kind of federal allocations and appropriations of where wildfire funding is going. We did a study that looked at what were the true wildfire costs at the community scale for a significant disaster. So in terms of not looking at just the upfront expenditures related to suppression, but what was beyond that? What were the other long-term expenses that started to accrue in the many months and even years following a wildfire, and who was paying for those? And what we found is that, in fact, more than half of all wildfire costs are coming at that local scale. And that's the form of, lost ecosystem services, infrastructure rebuilding, stabilizing hillsides, property loss values. The other one was business loss, revenue loss. And so when you start to account for these long-term, often overlooked expenses, it's actually quite high. And that suppression accounts for around 10%, if not less, of total wildfire costs. And other literature has similarly indicated that. That was one study. I think more relevant for California, and something that is going to be very hopefully released here, I would say in the next month or two, early 2022, is a partnership we're doing with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is IBHS is the acronym. And we are doing an accounting of what it would cost to build a home beyond Chapter 7A compliance. So what is it? Chapter 7A, Building Code of California, is great. It requires a lot of these building and hardening home techniques, but it's not a fully wildfire resistant home. And so what would it actually cost? What would be the differential overhead to construct a home in the north and south region of California that truly met the best performance standards we know for wildfire resistance? So that is a cost analysis that we'll be releasing here very shortly. And I can't really indicate the preliminary results just yet because we're still running through the analysis, but that is something I hope to be able to share very soon. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and a follow-up question. I understand that basically this research has been focused on the monetary value and maybe direct and indirect, but when it comes to social and ecosystem, there are value of there are losses that cannot be measured in a monetary metrics, or maybe can be, and I'm not aware of it. So I wanted to see if there is any way to measure the loss of ecosystem or the social loss on people, or are there ways to really measure these things or put the monetary value to them as well?
Yeah, there's case studies of it being done. I know the Hayman fire out of California had a fairly extensive case study that tried to capture some of more of those, I would say, qualitative metrics. It's challenging for a number of reasons. One is some of those impacts don't manifest until many months later, and so directly linking them to any specific wildfire can be challenging. Also, the accountability in terms of how they are recorded and collected at various levels of agency is not consistent. So how BLM, Bureau of Land Management, for example, may capture something, it's not going to be the same way that, the Forest Service might capture something, specifically with respect to ecosystem services. So it's challenging on a number of fronts. I think the health questions are very interesting because I know that there's a number of scientists working at this with respect to, specifically to air particulates and respiratory challenges. And so that is something that I know Stanford's running a study on that, trying to capture that out of, how many people have checked into hospitals during wildfires. Things like that are starting to come up. But besides some of the preliminary work out there, I can't say it's something that's probably been heavily studied until more recently.
Thank you.
Let me jump in with a question of mine. So the risks that you're calculating, Kimi, does that also include like the availability of firefighting resources in that, well, there's this region, it's highly susceptible, but they have like tons of
Yeah,
people who fight, and then so it's not as high risk as
sure.
someone it does,
Great
or
question, ET. Yeah, that's a great question. Not yet. This tool is, the tools are only coming out as of 2020. So they're still very much in, I would say, their nascent forms. That is certainly coming up, specifically with relief towards evacuation and assistance in that manner. So things like firefighting station proximity to some of these areas, that is not yet captured in this. So short answer is no, ET. Long answer would be there's obviously a lot of potential to expand and diversify the tool to better capture some of that. The other thing it doesn't capture, there's lots of limitations, as I'm sure this group knows well, with modeling. It doesn't capture climate projections is a big one. It doesn't, to date, there's no models out there that can effectively capture what happens when a home starts to burn and how that changes fire behavior. So when you're dealing with something like the Carr fire, what happened in Santa Rosa, and one home starts to burn, the urban conflagration that starts to happen after that can't be modeled very well, because you just, it's our technology, our computing science can't keep up with that just yet. So that's a big limitation to it. Even the EmberCast is very much in its early forms of development. So the models are great. They can be improved. And that's obviously what many, certainly in this group, are working on, and others.
I see Dr. Ahmadi's hand up from Anderson School of Management. Hi, Dr. Ahmadi. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation. I have a simple question. Do you have any breakdown in terms of the cost of the prevention for fire versus the cost of containment, and the total cost and the damage that it inflicts on this society?
Yes, I can tell you. I mean, anecdotally,
Right.
And there's some good studies that are coming out there. I know California did just release one, and I wish I could say it off the top of my head what it was, but we know suppression's on the range of $3.5 to $5 billion per year minimally, right? That's based off our best accounting from the federal levels of agency. What are we spending for prevention? Not much compared to that. Most of prevention goes towards forest treatment. And that is reflected not only with the most recent infrastructure bill, but also in Governor Newsom's state budget. I would say 80% of all prevention efforts are going towards forest treatments and hazardous fuel reduction. Very little of it goes towards the built environment and directing it towards efforts like home hardening or retrofitting. So that is something through Headwaters Economics and in partnership with others that we're really pushing for that policy change, is starting to redirect that to the built environment. And so that's obviously an area that needs a lot of additional support and bolstering. The retrofit problem in California is substantial. A large proportion of your housing stock predates the 2008 building code of Chapter 7A. So trying to retrofit those existing structures that are located in wildfire-prone areas is a significant need. And we also know that upfront investment pays off, as with all hazardous mitigation efforts. So, there's anywhere from every dollar spent, you're going to get $4 in return on that cost benefit ratio. In other hazards, it's even higher, I've heard. So we do know that those upfront costs have long-term dividends, and that what we're spending right now for containing and extinguishing a wildfire is not sustainable financially. And yes, things need to transform and shift at a very institutional level, but the inertia is pretty heavy right now.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So you talked about the basically preparedness mitigation, or what we call intervention action, that we can take for a community to make it fire adaptable. But how can we measure the impacts of these measurements, or how can we make sure that what we are doing is enough for this community? When it comes to, for example, arguing with U.S. Forest Service that you have to bring in the investment from forest management to, for example, preparedness and mitigation, we need to have some measurement tool to say that this scenario works better than this, and this you get more bangs for your buck than here. How can we do that? Or is there any work done on comparing influence?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, forest treatments and forest management, I don't know the answer to that because, you know, we deal so exclusively with the built environment. What I can tell you is that in terms of measuring the benefits to the built environment, there are recent studies, and I'm like in the past couple of years. One of them was done through Stanford, and then there was one done on the Camp Fire of 2018 that was recently released as well. And it does show with, you know, statistical and actual findings now that indeed homes that, you know, meet these mitigation measures that actually incorporate things like proximity, building to building distances to reduce ignition and radiant heat exposure, and have homes that are better built and designed with wildfire in mind, have a 40% higher likelihood of surviving. So the research is coming out there. Whether that's compelling enough to persuade this broad shift in transformative change in providing more resources and funding for mitigation and prevention, I'm not sure. I don't know if trying to capture the metrics is enough to try and encourage that change. You would think 88 people dying in the Camp Fire would have been enough of a metric, and it hasn't been. So it's a great question. I don't know if it can be so cleanly answered as saying, you know, this proportion of homes survived and these proportion of homes didn't. That's the only way I can honestly answer some of those built environment questions with respect to mitigation efforts right now, but I would love to entertain additional ideas.
Brian?
Hi, yeah, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I had a question about the most recent effort you're talking about that'll be released soon, and maybe comparing that to the 2018 report that Headwaters Economics did with IBHS on the cost mitigation measures. So you're talking now about going beyond the types of measures that were identified in that 2018 report, and to check on that, but then also, you know, you were talking about materials a little bit and different approaches. You know, have you looked at the concept of, you know, why do we build all these buildings in timber frame? What would be the economic benefits or detriments of moving to concrete in terms of, you know, for example, fire resistivity, different impacts on the economy for different labor? I mean, how broadly have you looked at alternatives to just, you know, trying to make a combustible building less susceptible to burning?
That's a great question, Brian. Yeah, so this is an extension of the 2018 report we did. So for everybody else's reference, 2018, we did a similar study with IBHS as well, looking at differential cost building efforts for a home built in Southwest Montana. That's very important. It was indicative of settings located in the Rocky Mountain, Intermountain region, really. So you're looking at a home, for example, with a roof shingle, or cedar shaped siding was the big one. Things that, building materials that are very indicative of preferences here in the Rocky Mountains. And then what would it cost to build a home more resistant to wildfire? So that was a 2018 study. We got a lot of pushback from folks like on the coastal states saying, hey, those aren't building materials we use. That's not the same cost comparison. And we said, very, very valid point. Let's replicate that study for California alone, and let's look at standard typical construction practices for both the North and the South region to 7A. And then what would it look like to build beyond that to like a code plus enhanced version? To answer your question, Brian, we are not going to that level of detail with terms of like structural steel frame instead, or non-combustible entirely. We don't do that because that was not what the request was. And I say that because it leaves a huge disclaimer for areas of future research and improvement. I'm doing this as a co-authorship with Dr. Steve Quarles. He is, as we speak, writing the language to address your question, Brian, because you are not the first to ask that. You know, what is the parameters we're approaching this research report on, and why aren't we looking at some of these truly non-combustible materials, specifically in areas that we know are going to burn. And so, you know, California obviously has this huge housing crunch, and the governor is requiring additional homes be built in places that we know are experiencing wildfire. So what would be the cost to just go ahead and I don't want to say concrete bunker, but a home that's truly equipped to be much more fire resistant than what we're even indicating in this report. So yeah, Brian, the answer is no. It's a space for research and better understanding.
Thank you.
Branko?
Yeah, thank you for a nice talk. I have a question that goes a step maybe further regarding the ignitions. Considering that in particular in California, 80% of ignitions are human related. Have you looked at a way to, and the cost of mitigating that, reducing the number of ignitions, in particular from power lines or, I don't know, the other practices that, that result in ignitions?
Yeah, great question. Branko, no, we have not. That is not an area that we have delved in, but Dr. Jennifer Balch out of University of Colorado deals a lot with, you know, sources of ignition, particularly those human caused. I don't know if she's gotten into the economics yet so much as the underlying data and causes behind some of those human ignited fires. She's really the one I know of who's leading a lot of the efforts here, at least maybe, you know, in the West. Though certainly others are researching that. But what would it cost? I don't know if anybody is getting into that yet. It's a great question.
Thank you.
All right, we have just a couple more minutes. Any last questions? Let me ask one question then. What, in your opinion, Kimi, are the most important research areas? What are the, you know, topics to be explored that would just improve the assessment of the impact of wildfires?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great closure question, E.T. I think the big one's climate, right? How do you effectively, accurately capture climate projections alongside wildfire behavior, given that it's changing so rapidly, that, you know, these increasingly, you know, experiences we're having with wildfire, the severity, the extreme conditions we're experiencing are only going to go up. So how do you capture that with respect to modeling is a big one. The big one that we are so interested in is trying to model what happens when structures start to burn. That amount of BTU being released when that one unit starts to burn changes wildfire behavior. So how do you model that when it becomes an urban conflagration? How would you model that in Santa Rosa when the first home starts to burn with a 70-mile-an-hour wind in dry conditions? You can't model it yet. And so that's really intriguing. And then what would happen if that, you know, if those homes hypothetically had gone on, you know, like trying to capture some of the proposed developments alongside increasing climate change and wildfire behavior, I think is a huge area for additional research. I know people are wanting to explore it, but right now it's a big unanswered question. So that's a big one. At Headwaters Economics, we're very, very interested in the retrofitting question. So that's another study we're going to start releasing here in 2022 is what's the number of structures that require retrofitting needs. So yeah, those are the ones that come to mind always for me. And closely related to that, how much of the government subsidies are needed to help offset some of those mitigation costs if you're asking homeowners to build to these additional resistant ignition requirements. How much would that cost and what is needed on a subsidy end for that?
Let me just ask also one final question then. We know now that I'm an engineer, so my knowledge is limited, but we know now that carbon dioxide emissions are being monetized, right? So everybody's paying for it. There's an economy of it. Do the carbon dioxide emissions come into play in your calculations? Like, of course, when trees burn, there's emissions, and then of course those trees cannot absorb carbon dioxide, so on and so forth. But there's also the homes, like when they burn, you have to rebuild. There's cost of carbon dioxide emissions. So does that play a role in your calculations yet, or is that?
Yeah, the modeling is all done through our partners in Pyrologics and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. To my knowledge, they do not talk about that right now, ET. Is my understanding. I could be wrong in that, but yeah, I think that is certainly another area that's requiring additional understanding. Yeah, so not so far. I think the climate is a big one. I think trying to better integrate all of those various drivers and long-term projections could greatly benefit our understanding of wildfire behavior and the built environment and adaptation needs. Certainly, yeah.
All right, many thanks for the wonderful presentation and your great answers to our many questions. We have many more, but maybe we'll follow up on a separate meeting. So I invite everyone to give you like an applause and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.